Good luck, everyone. Good evening. Welcome, welcome. Oh, look at all these names showing up on the sidebar. I'm so glad you're all here to join us tonight. Just give everybody a minute here to enter the Zoom room and settle in and get comfy. Looks like a good list. Hi, Mom. Great. Oh, it's so nice to see such a list of familiar faces and names on the list there. That's just a little witchy humor, familiar. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's wonderful to be back with Inside the Actors Quarantine. Some of you may have caught our earlier rendition when we first started this initiative at the beginning of lockdown. I think right at the beginning of April, we started running weekly virtual online readings and virtual online. And now that summer is over, we've decided to bring it back. And what better reason to start than celebrating a spooky, cozy indoor evening of ghost stories and Halloween themed lore. So we have a wonderful lineup for you tonight. And I think it's good to get things started now. It looks like everybody's settled in more or less. So we're going to start with the one and only Jude Neal, who brings us The Man Who Forgot Ray Bradbury by Neil Gaiman. And by way of introduction, we each have our own little triggers, things that wait for us in the dark corners of our lives.
I am forgetting things, which scares me. I'm losing words, although I'm not losing concepts. I hope I'm not losing concepts. If I'm losing concepts, I'm not aware of it. If I am losing concepts, how would I know? Which is funny, because my memory was always so good. Everything was in there. Sometimes my memory was so good that I even thought I could remember things I didn't know yet. Remembering forward. I don't think there's a word for that, is there? Remembering things that haven't happened yet? I don't have that feeling I get when I go looking into my head for a word that isn't there, as if someone must have taken it in the night. When I was a young man, I lived in a big shared house. I was a student then. We had our own shelves in the kitchen, neatly marked with our names, and our own shelves in the fridge, upon which we kept our own eggs, yogurt, milk. I was always punctilious about using my own provisions. Others were not so. There, I lost a word. One that would mean careful to obey the rules. The other people in the house were not so. I would go to the fridge, but my eggs would have vanished. I am thinking of a sky filled with spaceships, so many of them, that they seemed like a plague of locust silver against the luminous mauve of the night. Things would go missing from my room back then as well. Boots. I remember my boots going, or being gone, I should say, as I did not actually catch them in the act of leaving. Boots don't just go up and go. Somebody went them, just like my big dictionary. Same house, same time period. I went to the small bookshelf beside my bed. Everything was by my bed. It was my room, but it was not much larger than a cupboard. I went to the shelf, and the dictionary was gone. Just a dictionary-size hole in my shelf to show where my dictionary wasn't. All the words in the books they came in were gone. Over the next month, they also took my radio, a can of shaving foam, a pad of notepaper, and a box of pencils, and my yogurt. And I discovered, power cut my candles. Now I'm thinking of a boy with new tennis shoes who believes he can run forever, No, that's not giving it to me. A dry town on which it rained forever. No, a road through the desert on which good people see a mirage. A dinosaur that's a movie producer. The mirage was a pleasure dome with Kublai Khan. No, sometimes when the words go away, I can find them by creeping up on them from another direction. Say I go and look for a word. I'm discussing the inhabitants of the planet Mars, say, and I realize that the word has gone. I might realize that the missing word occurs in a sentence or title. The blank chronicles my favorite blank. If that does not give it to me, I circle the idea. Little green men, I think, are tall, dark skinned, gentle, dark they were, and golden eyed. And suddenly the word Martians is waiting for me, like a friend or a lover at the end of a long day. I left that house, my radio went. It was too wearing. The slow disappearance of the things I thought so safely mine, item by item, thing by thing, object by object, word by word. When I was 12, I was told a story by an old man that I have never forgotten. A poor man found himself in a forest, night fell, and he had no prayer book to say his evening prayers. So he said, God, who knows all things, I have no prayer book and I do not know any prayers by heart, but you know all the prayers. You are God. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to say the alphabet and I'll let you put the words together. There are things missing from my mind, and it scares me. Icarus! It's not as if I've forgotten all names. I remember Icarus. He flew too close to the sun. In the stories, though, it's worth it. Always worth it to have tried, even if you fail, even if you fall like a meteor forever. Better to have flamed in the darkness, to have inspired others, to have lived, than to have sat in the darkness cursing the people who borrowed but did not return your candle. I have lost people, though. It's strange when it happens. I don't actually lose them, not the way one loses one's parents, either as a small child when you think you're holding your mother's hand in a crowd, you look up and it's not your mother. When you have to find the words to describe them at a funeral service, or a memorial, or when you're scattering ashes on a garden of flowers over the sea. I sometimes imagine I would like my ashes to be scattered in a library, but the librarians would just have to carry them up next morning to sweep them up again before the people got there. I would like my ashes scattered in the library, or possibly a fun fair, a 1930s fun fair where you ride the black, the, I've lost the word, carousel, roller coaster, the thing you ride and you become young again, the Ferris wheel, yes. There's another carnival that comes to town as well, bringing evil by the pricking of my thumbs. Shakespeare. I remember Shakespeare, and I remember his name and who he was and what he wrote. He's safer now. Perhaps there are people who forget Shakespeare. They would have to talk about the man who wrote To Be or Not to Be, not the film starring Jack Benny, whose real name was Benjamin Kubelski, who was raised in Waukegan, Illinois, an hour or so outside of Chicago. Waukegan, Illinois was later immortalized as Greentown, Illinois, in a series of stories and books by an American author who left Waukegan and went to live in LA. I mean, of course, the man I'm thinking of. I can see him in my head when I close my eyes. I used to look at his photograph on the back of his book. He looked mild, he looked wise, he looked kind. He wrote a story about Poe. to stop Poe from being forgotten, about a future where they turn books and they forget them. And in the story, we are on Mars, although we might as well be in Waukegan or Los Angeles as critics of those who would repress or forget books, or those who would take the words, all the words, dictionaries, radios full of words, as those people are walked through a house and murdered one by orangutan, by pit and pendulum, for the love of God, Montresor, Poe. I know Poe and Montresor and Benjamin Kubelski and his wife Sadie Marks, who was no relation to the Marx brothers and who performed as Mary Livingston. All these names in my head. I was 12. I had read the books. I had seen the film, and the burning point of paper was the moment when I knew that I would have to remember this, because people would have to remember books. If any other people burn them or forget them, we will commit them to memory. We will become them. We become authors. We become their books. I am sorry, I lost something there, like a path I was walking that dead-ended, and now I am alone and lost in the forest. I'm here, and I do not know where here is anymore. You must learn a Shakespeare play. I will think of you as Titus, as Andronicus, or you, whoever you are. You could learn an Edgar Christie novel, and you could be Murder on the Orient Express. Someone else can learn the poems of John Wilmot, Earl of Rochester, and you, whoever you are reading this, can learn a Dickens book. And when I want to know what happens to Barnaby Rudge, I will come to you. You can tell me. And the people who would burn the words, the people who would take the books from the shelves, the firemen and the ignorant, and the ones afraid of tales and words and dreams and Halloween, and people who have tattooed themselves with stories and boys. You can grow mushrooms in your cellar, and as long as your words, which are people, which are days, which are my life, as long as your words survive, then you've lived and you've mattered and you changed the world, and I cannot remember your name. I learned your books, burned them into my mind in case the firemen came to town, but who you are is gone. I wait for it to return to me, just as I waited for my dictionary or my radio or my boots, with a meager result. All I have left is the space in my mind where you used to be. I'm not so certain. I am talking to a friend, and I said, are those stories familiar to you? I told him all the words I knew, the one about the monsters coming home to the house with the human child in it, the ones about the lightning salesman and the wicked carnival that followed him, and the Martians and their fallen glass cities and their perfect canals. I told them all the words, and he said he hadn't heard of any of them. They didn't exist. And I worry I was keeping them alive, like the people in the snow at the end of the story, walking backwards and forwards, remembering, repeating the words of the stories, making them real. I think it's God's fault. I mean, he can't be expected to remember everything. God can't. Busy chap. So perhaps he delegates things, sometimes just goes, you, I want you to remember the dates of the 100 Years' War. You remember Okapi. You remember Jack Benny. And then when you forget the things God has charged you with remembering, no more Okapi. Just an Okapi-shaped hole in the world, which is halfway between an antelope and a giraffe. No more Jack Benny, no more Waukegan, just a hole in your mind where a person or a concept used to be. I don't know. I don't know where to look. Have I lost an author just as once I lost a dictionary, or worse, did God give me this one small task, and now I have failed him, and because I have forgotten him, he has gone from the shelves, gone from the reference works, and now he only exists in our dreams. My dreams. I do not know your dreams. Perhaps you do not dream of a velvet that is only wallpaper but it eats 2 children. Perhaps you do not know that Mars is heaven, or a beloved get go to wait for us and consume us in the night. You do not dream of a man arrested for the crime of being a pedestrian. I dream these things. If he existed, then I have lost him, lost his name, lost his book titles one by one, lost his stories. I'm going mad, for I cannot just be growing old. If I have failed in this one task, oh God, then only let me do this thing, that you may give me the stories back to the world. Because perhaps if this works, they will remember him. All of them will remember him. His name will once more become synonymous with small American towns at Halloween, with the leaves skitter across the sidewalk like frightened birds, or with Mars, or with love, and my name will be forgotten. I'm willing to pay that price if the empty space in the bookshelf of my mind can be filled again before I go. Dear God, hear my prayer. A, B, C, D, E.
Ooh, thank you, Jude. That was The Man Who Forgot Ray Bradbury by Neil Gaiman. And I just love how it played with that dual fear, both of forgetting the world around you and being forgotten by it. Thank you so much, Jude. Next up, we have a whole host of voices here to haunt your evening. And I'd just like to say that sometimes stories are better told in the dark, in the complete dark. So we invite you to close your eyes, open your inner mind, and listen to the whole host of voices that are about to surround you with The Monkey's Paw by W.W. Jacobs. This was written in 1902, and I think there's a theme that will resonate with you. Be careful what you wish for. It might come true.
Outside, the night was cold and wet, but in the small living room, the curtains were closed and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were playing chess, the father, whose ideas about the game involved some very unusual moves, putting his king into such sharp and unnecessary danger that it even brought comment from the white-haired old lady knitting quietly by the fire.
Listen to the wind,
said Mr. White, who, having seen a mistake that could cost him the game after it was too late, was trying to stop his son from seeing it.
I'm listening,
said the son, seriously studying the board as he stretched out his hand.
Check.
I should hardly think that he'll...
said his father, with his hand held in the air over the board.
Mate,
replied the son.
That's the worst of it, living so far out.
Of all the awful, out-of-the-way places to live in, this is the worst. Can't walk on the footpath without getting stuck in the mud, and the road's a river. I don't know what the people are thinking about. I suppose they think it doesn't matter because only 2 houses in the road have people in them.
Oh, never mind, dear,
said his wife calmly. Mr. White looked up sharply, just in time to see a knowing look between mother and son. The words died away on his lips, and he hid a guilty smile in his thin gray beard.
There he is,
said Herbert White, as the gate banged shut loudly and heavy footsteps came towards the door. The old man rose quickly and, opening the door, was heard telling the new arrival how sorry he was for his recent loss. The new arrival talked about his sadness, so that Mrs. White said,
"Tut, tut,"
as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, heavy-built, strong-looking man whose skin had the healthy reddish color associated with the outdoor life whose eyes showed that he could be a dangerous enemy.
Sergeant Major Morris,
He said, introducing him to his wife and to his son, Herbert. The sergeant major shook hands and, taking the offered seat by the fire, watched with satisfaction as Mr. White got out whiskey and glasses. After the third glass, his eyes got brighter and he began to talk. The little family circle listened with growing interest to his visitor from distant parts as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of wild scenes and brave acts, of wars and strange people.
21 years of it,
said Mr. White, looking at his wife and son.
When he went away, he was a thin young man. Now look at him.
Oh, he doesn't look to have taken much harm,
said Mrs. White politely.
I'd like to go to India myself, just to look around a bit, you know.
Better where you are,
said the sergeant major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass and, sighing softly, shook it again.
I should like to see those old temples and the fakirs and the street entertainers. What was all that you started telling me about the other day about a monkey's paw or something, Morris?
Nothing. Well, it's just a bit of magic, what you might call that. Magic, perhaps?
His three listeners leaned forward excitedly. Deep in thought, the visitor put his empty glass to his lips and then set it down again. Mr. White filled it up for him again.
Look at it.
Said
It's just an ordinary little paw, dried to a mummy.
He took something out of his pocket and held it out for them. Mrs. White drew back with a look of disgust, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously.
And what is there special about it?
Asked Mr. White as he took it from his son and, having examined it, placed it on the table.
Well, it had a spell put on it by an old fakir, a very holy man, and he wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives and that those who tried to change it would be very sorry. He put a spell on it so that 3 different men could each have 3 wishes from it.
The way he told the story showed that he truly believed it, and his listeners became aware that their light laughter was out of place and had hurt him a little.
Well, why don't you have 3, sir?
Said Herbert cleverly. The soldier looked at him the way that the middle-aged usually look at disrespectful youth.
I have,
he said quietly, and his face whitened.
And did you really have the 3 wishes granted?
I did,
said the sergeant major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth.
And has anybody else wished?
Well, the first man had his 3 wishes, yes, and I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was for death. And that's how I got the paw.
His voice was so serious that the group fell silent.
If you've had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now then, is it, Morris? What do you keep it for?
The soldier shook his head.
Fancy, I suppose. I did have some idea of selling it, but I don't think I will. It has caused me enough trouble already. And besides, people won't buy. They think it's just a story, and some of them, and those who do think anything of it, want to try it first and pay me afterwards.
If you could have another 3 wishes, would you have them?
I don't know. I don't know.
He took the paw and, holding it between his front finger and thumb, suddenly threw it in the fire. Mr. White, with a slight cry, quickly bent down and took it off.
Oh, better let it burn,
said the soldier sadly, but in a way that let them know that he believed it to be true.
If you don't want it, Morris, give to me.
I won't. I throw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't hold me responsible for what happens. Throw it on the fire, like a sensible man.
The other shook his head and examined his possession closely.
How do you do it?
Hold it up in your right hand and state your wish out loud so that it can be heard. But I warn you of what might happen.
Oh, sounds like the Arabian Nights.
Said Mrs. White as she rose and began to set the dinner.
No, don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me?
Her husband drew the talisman from his pocket, and all three laughed loudly as the sergeant major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught him by the arm.
If you must wish, wish for something sensible.
Mr. White dropped it back in his pocket and, placing chairs, motioned his friend to the table. In the business of dinner, the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterwards the three sat fascinated as they listened to more of the soldier's adventures in India.
If that's the tale about the monkey's paws, not more truthful than those he's been telling us,
said Herbert as the door closed behind their guest, just in time to catch the last train.
we shan't make much of it.
Oh, did you give anything for it, Father?
Asked Mrs. White, watching her husband closely.
A little. He didn't want it, but I made him take it. And he pressed me again to throw it
Not
away.
likely.
Said Herbert with pretended horror.
Why, we're going to be rich and famous and happy. Wish to be king, father, to begin with, and mother can't complain all the time.
He ran quickly around the table, chased by the laughing Mrs. White, armed with a piece of cloth. Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it doubtfully.
I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact. It seems to me I've got all I want.
Well, if you only paid off the house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you? Well, wish for £200, then that'll just do it.
His father, smiling and with an embarrassed look for his foolishness in believing the soldier's story, held up the talisman. Herbert, with a serious face, spoiled only by a quick smile to his mother, sat down at the piano and struck a few grand chords.
I wish for £200,
said the old man, clearly. A fine crash from the piano greeted his words, broken by a frightened cry from the old man. His wife and his son ran towards him.
It moved.
He cried with a look of horror at the object as it lay on the floor.
As I wished it twisted in my hands like a snake.
Well, I don't see the money,
said his son as he picked it up and placed it on the table.
and I bet I never shall.
Oh, it must have been your imagination, dear.
He shook his head.
Never mind, though. There's no harm done, but it gave me a shock all the same.
They sat down by the fire again while the two men finished their pipes. Outside, the wind was higher than ever, and the old man jumped nervously at the sound of a door banging upstairs. An unusual and depressing silence settled on all three, which lasted until the old couple got up to go to bed.
I expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed.
Said Herbert as he wished them good night.
And something horrible sitting on top of your wardrobe watching you as you pocket all your ill-gotten money.
Herbert, who normally had a playful nature and didn't like to take things too seriously, sat alone in the darkness, looking into the fire. He saw faces in it, the last so horrible and so monkey-like that he stared at it in amazement. It became so clear that, with a nervous laugh, he felt on the table for a glass containing some water to throw over it. His hand found the monkey's paw, and with a little shake of his body, he wiped his hand on his coat and went up to bed. In the brightness of the wintry sun next morning, as it streamed over the breakfast table, he laughed at his fears. The room felt as if it always had, and there was an air of health and happiness, which was not there the previous night. The dirty, dried up little paw was thrown on the cabinet with a carelessness which indicated no great belief in what it could do.
I suppose all old soldiers are the same. The idea of our listening to such nonsense. How could wishes be granted in these days? And if they could, how could £200 hurt you, Father?
might drop on his head from the sky.
Morris said the things happen so naturally that you might, if you so wished, not see the relationship.
Well, don't break into the money before I come back. I'm afraid I'll turn into a mean, greedy old man, and we shall have to tell everyone that we don't know you.
His mother laughed, and following him to the door, watched him go down the road, and returning to the breakfast table, she felt very happy at the expense of her husband's readiness to believe such stories, all of which did not prevent her from hurrying to the door at the postman's knock, nor when she found that the post brought only a bill, and talking about how sergeant majors can develop bad drinking habits after they leave the army.
Oh, Herbert will have some more of his funny remarks, I expect, when he comes home,
she said as they sat to dinner.
I know,
said Mr. White, pouring himself out some beer.
but for all that, the thing moved in my hand, that I'll swear to.
Oh, you thought it did.
I say it did. There was no thought about it. I had just, what's the matter?
His wife made no reply. She was watching the mysterious movements of a man outside, who, looking in an undecided fashion at the house, appeared to be trying to make up his mind to enter. In mental connection with the £200, she noticed that the stranger was well dressed and wore a silk hat of shiny newness. 3 times he stopped briefly at the gate and then walked on again. The 4th time he stood with his hand upon it, and then with a sudden firmness of mind pushed it open and walked up the path. Mrs. White at the same time placed her hands behind her hurriedly, untied the strings of her apron, and put it under the cushion of her chair. She brought the stranger, who seemed a little uncomfortable, into the room. He looked at her in a way that said there was something about his purpose that he wanted to keep secret, and seemed to be thinking of something else. As the old lady said, she was sorry for the appearance of the room and her husband's coat, which usually wore in the garden. She then waited as patiently as her sex would permit for him to state his business. But he was first strangely silent.
I was asked to call. I come from Ma and Muggins.
The old lady jumped up in a sudden alarm.
Is anything the matter? Has anything happened to Herbert? What is it? What is it?
Her husband spoke before he could answer.
There, mother, sit down and don't jump to a conclusion. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, sir.
And eyed the other, expecting that it was bad news, but hoping he was wrong.
I'm sorry.
Is he hurt?
The visitor lowered and raised his head once in agreement.
Badly hurt, but he is not in pain.
Oh, thank God. Thank God for that.
She broke off as the tragic meaning of the part about him not being in pain came to her. The man had turned his head slightly, so as not to look directly at her, but she saw the awful truth in his face. She caught her breath and turning to her husband, who did not yet understand the man's meaning, laid her shaking hand on his. There was a long silence.
He was caught in the machinery.
Caught in the machinery.
Repeated Mr. White, too shocked to think clearly.
Yes.
He sat staring out the window and taking his wife's hand between his own, pressed it as he used to do when he was trying to win her love in the time before they were married, nearly 40 years before.
He was the only one left to us.
He said, turning gently to the visitor.
It is hard.
The other coughed and, rising, walked slowly to the window.
The firm wishes me to pass on their great sadness about your loss. I ask that you please understand that I am only their servant and simply doing what they told me to do.
There was no reply. The old woman's face was white, her eyes staring and her breath unheard. On her husband's face was a look such as his friend, the sergeant major, might have carried into his first battle.
I was to say that Ma and Muggins accept no responsibility, but although they don't believe that they have a legal requirement to make payment to you for your loss, in view of your son's services, they wish to present you with a certain sum.
Mr. White dropped his wife's hand and, rising to his feet, stared with a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips shaped the words.
How much?
£200.
Without hearing his wife scream, the old man smiled weakly, put out his hands like a blind man, and fell, a senseless mass, to the floor. In the huge new cemetery, some 2 miles away, the old people buried their dead and came back to the house, which was now full of shadows and silence. It was all over so quickly that at first they could hardly realize it and remained in a state of waiting for something else to happen. Something else was to lighten this load too heavy for old hearts to bear. But the days passed, and as they realized that they had to accept the situation, the hopeless acceptance of the old, sometimes they hardly said a word to each other, for now they had nothing to talk about, and their days were long to tiredness. It was about a week after that the old man, waking suddenly in the night, stretched out his hand and found himself alone. The room was in darkness, and he could hear the sound of his wife crying quietly at the window. He raised himself in bed and listened.
Come back. You'll be cold.
It is colder for my son.
The sounds of crying died away on his ears. The bed was warm and his eyes heavy with sleep. He slept lightly at first and then was fully asleep until a sudden wild cry from his wife woke him with a start.
The paw!
He cried wildly.
The monkey's paw!
He started up in alarm.
Where is it? What's the matter?
She almost fell as she came hurriedly across the room toward him.
I want it. You've not destroyed it.
It's in the living room on the shelf above the fireplace. Why?
She cried and laughed together and, bending over, kissed his cheek.
I only just thought of it. Why didn't I think of it before? Why didn't you think of it before?
Think of what?
Oh, the other two wishes. We've only had one.
Was that not enough?
Oh, no. We'll have one more. Go down and get it quickly and wish our boy with us again.
The man sat up in bed and threw the blankets from his shaking legs.
Good God, are you mad?
Get it quickly and wish. Oh, my boy, my boy, my boy.
Her husband struck a match and lit the candle.
Get back to bed, he said. You don't know what you're saying.
We had the first wish granted. Why not the second?
A coincidence.
No, go get it and wish.
The old man turned and looked at her, and his voice shook.
He has been dead 10 days. And besides, I would not tell you about it before, but I can only recognize him by his clothing. If he was too terrible for you to see then, how now?
Oh, bring him back. Do you think I fear the child I have raised, I have missed, I have nursed?
He went down in the darkness and felt his way to the living room and then to the fireplace. The talisman was in its place on the shelf, and then a horrible fear came over him that the unspoken wish might bring the broken body of his son before him, before he could escape from the room. He caught his breath as he found that he had lost the direction of the door, his forehead cold with sweat. He felt his way round the table and along the walls until he found himself at the bottom of the stairs with the evil thing in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed changed as he entered the room. It was white and expectant, and to his fears seemed to have an unnatural look upon it. He was afraid of her.
Wish!
It is foolish and wicked.
Wish!
He raised his hand.
I wish my son alive again.
The talisman fell to the floor, and he looked at it fearfully. Then he sank into a chair, and the old woman, with burning eyes, walked to the window and opened the curtains. He sat until he could no longer bear the cold, looking up from time to time at the figure of his wife staring through the window. The candle, which had almost burned to the bottom, was throwing moving shadows around the room. When the candle finally went out, the old man, with unspeakable sense of relief at the failure of the talisman, went slowly back to his bed. And a minute afterwards, the old woman came silently and lay without movement beside him. Neither spoke, but lay silently listening to the ticking of the clock. They heard nothing else other than the normal night sounds. The darkness was depressing. And after lying for some time, building up his courage, the husband took the box of matches and, lighting one, went downstairs for another candle. At the foot of the stairs, the match went out, and he stopped to light another. And at the same moment, a knock sounded on the front door. It was so quiet that it could only be heard downstairs, as if the one knocking wanted to keep their coming a secret. The matches fell from his hand. He stood motionless, not even breathing, until the knock repeated. Then he turned and ran quickly back to his room and closed the door behind him. A third knock sounded through the house.
What's that?
A rat! A rat!
His wife sat up in bed listening. A loud knock echoed through the house.
Herbert! It's Herbert!
She ran to the door, but her husband was there before her, catching her by her arm, held her tightly.
What are you going to do?
It's my boy. It's Herbert. I forgot it was 2 miles away. What are you holding me for? Let me go. I must open the door.
For God's sake, don't let it in.
You're afraid of your own son. Let me go. I'm coming, Herbert. I'm coming.
There was another knock, and another. The old woman, with a sudden pull, broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed to the top of the stairs and called after her as she hurried down. He heard the chain pulled back and the bottom lock open. Then the old woman's voice, desperate and breathing heavily.
The top lock. Come down. I can't reach it.
But her husband was on his hands and knees, feeling round wildly on the floor in search of the paw. If only he could find it before the thing outside got in. The knocks came very quickly now, echoing through the house, and he heard the noise of his wife moving a chair and putting it down against the door. He heard the movement of the lock as she began to open it, and at the same moment, he found the monkey's paw and frantically breathed his third and last wish. The knocking stopped suddenly, although the echoes of it were still in the house. He heard the chair pulled back and the door opened. A cold wind blew up the staircase, and a long, loud cry of disappointment and pain from his wife gave him the courage to run down to her side and then to the gate. The street light opposite shone on a quiet and deserted road.
Thank you. That was The Monkey's Paw. I hope it gave you the heebie-jeebies listening to it in the dark like that, all those disembodied voices telling that story. We have 2 more wonderful spooky gifts for you this evening, and we're about to enter into the very familiar world of Edgar Allan Poe. It's very appropriate to share some Poe at this time of the year. And this evening, we're very fortunate to be bringing one of his most beloved poems to you. Now, on our Theater on the Isle board, we have the amazing Judy Getty, and in true Judy fashion, she has put together a well-researched introduction, which I'm happy to share with you now. Lenora is the name of the street in Deep Bay where for many years Bowen Island has celebrated Halloween. By chance, perhaps, it is also the name of the lost love in 2 of Edgar Allan Poe's poems, one having the same name, Lenore, and the other poem being, of course, The Raven, which we're reading tonight. The narrator in The Raven is reading some ancient lore when suddenly there comes a tapping at his chamber door. It is believed that this is a reference by Poe to a much older German poem about a lost love, a fair maiden who tragically dies young and returns from the grave to her grieving fiancé. In Poe's poem Lenore, written in 1843, the grieving fiancé finds it impossible to mourn his bride and hopes to meet her in paradise. Now, all 3 of these poems are thought to be early precursors to today's vampire mythology, with ghosts of lost love and spirits who return from the grave, and one very popular character in an animated vampire series called Castlevania, which is actually one of my favorites. Now tonight, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Fraser Elliott and Judy Getty reading Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven.
Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door.
Only this, and nothing more.
Distinctly I remember it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow. Vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels named Lenore.
Nameless here for evermore.
And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before. So that now to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door."
This it is, and nothing more.
Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," I said, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore. But the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door."
Darkness there, and nothing more.
Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams nor no mortal ever dreamed to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, "Lenore." This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, "Lenore."
Merely this, and nothing more.
Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning, soon again I heard a tapping somewhat louder than before. "Surely," said I, "surely that this is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore."
'Tis the wind, and nothing more.
Open here I flung a shutter, when with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mine of lord or lady perched above my chamber door, perched upon the bust of Pallas just above my chamber door.
Perched and sat, and nothing more.
Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. "Though my crest be shorn and shaven, thou," I said, "art sure no craven, ghastly grim and ancient raven wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on thy plutonium's shore."
Quoth the raven, "Nevermore."
Much I marveled, this ungainly fowl, to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door.
With such name as Nevermore.
But the raven, sitting lonely on the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, "Other friends have flown before, on the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before."
Then the bird said, "Nevermore."
Startled at the stillness, broken by reply so aptly spoken, "Doubtless," said I, "what it utters is its only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master, whom merciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, till his song one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope that melancholy burden bore."
Of never, nevermore.
But the raven, still beguiling all my fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door. Then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore
Meant in croaking nevermore.
This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight gloated o'er, but whose velvet violet lining with the lamplight gloating o'er.
She shall press, nevermore.
Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from unseen censer, swung by seraphim whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee, by the angels he hath sent thee, respite, respite, and nepenthe from thy memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff this kind nepenthe, and forget this lost Lenore.
Quoth the raven, nevermore.
Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, with whether tempter sent, or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted, tell me truly I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me I implore.
Quoth the raven, nevermore.
Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore. Tell this soul with sorrow laden, if within the distant Aidenn it shall clasp a sainted maiden, whom the angels name Lenore, clasp a rare and radiant maiden, who the angels name Lenore.
Quoth the raven, nevermore.
Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked, upstarting. Get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart and take thy form from off my door.
Quoth the raven, nevermore.
And the raven, never flirting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, and his eyes have all the seeming of a demon that is dreaming, and the lamplight over him steaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor
shall be lifted nevermore.
Oh, I just love those last lines of Poe there. Shall be lifted nevermore. Thank you so much. That's a wonderful poem. It's always over too soon. We have one more tricky treat for you tonight. This one is to send you off to bed with a little case of the heebie-jeebies, because this is a true tale of spooky things that happened on Bowen Island, and it's told by Helen Walwork, who actually experienced the thing. And the name of this piece, I think, is particularly appropriate because it's those three little words that we've all said to ourselves in the dark after encountering something that goes bump in the night. What was that?
Once upon a time, on a dark and stormy night, my friend and I were walking home from visiting friends at Fairweather Bay. It was a long and winding path back to our cabin. The moon was hidden behind the dark scudding clouds, and the wind was moaning through the trees, rustling the long grass and bushes that lined the dark dirt track we were walking on. Our inadequate little flashlight was blinking on and off, on and off. It was next to useless, but we knew the path well, having walked it many times. The wind was picking up now and starting to moan louder through the alders and the maples. We heard some cracking branches and moved closer to each other and picked up our pace. We came to the straight part of the path next to the huge field where the golf course is now. The clouds were darker and the wind was howling, and just then the flashlight gave up the ghost completely. Pitch black, howling wind, and then a noise far off in the distance. What was that? My friend said. Don't stop, I squeaked. Keep going. But then I heard it too. coming closer and louder and unlike anything I'd heard before that night. It was not the wind nor the cracking branches. It sounded as it got closer like an animal, huffing, snorting, running, clop, clop, closer and closer. And then it was upon us. With nowhere to run or hide, we huddled together in the middle of the path as all around us the animals passed us by, that we could smell their breath and their sweat and feel the earth rumble as they pounded by us. We clung to each other and buffeted round and round as they galloped towards the sea. Then silence. The wind died down, the clouds parted. We could now see the path by the pale, weak moonlight. When we stopped shaking, we looked down at the path. Not one hoof print, not one mark in the dusty, damp earth. We didn't speak till we got home. We lit the lamps, had a hot drink from the large kettle on the old wood stove. It was then I recalled hearing the story of how Seymour Bay was developed by men and horses, barging them into the bay, offloading them onto the beach. They worked their way up from the beach, cutting into the old growth forest. They used the horses to log and pull and flatten the road into the middle of the island. The story was that the work was so arduous, it took many crews of men and horses. And the horses were worked till they dropped. That's them, I said. What's them? It was the ghost of the horses that died taming the wilderness that once was Bowen. And to this day, I believe it to be so.
Thank you, Helen. So that'll send you off with some creepy crawly feelings into your beds tonight. Of course, we won't blame you all if you decide to sleep with the lights on tonight. After all, we always leave a light on in the theater. It's called the ghost light, and it's to keep the ghosts from taking over the whole place. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, everyone, and a huge thank you to our wonderful cast who shared brilliant stories tonight. Could everyone please start your videos and come back on for a curtain call, take a bow, wave to the crowd?
Why are they on?
We've had a ninja surprise attack here. Oh my goodness. Terrifying. Thank you, one and all. Have a fabulous Halloween. Stay safe out there. Take good care. And I hope you enjoy a good scare or two in the next week. We'll see you soon. Good night.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.